This is an online Q&A discussing Trump, tariffs, and market shocks, making sense of the chaos, hosted by the Socialist Workers' Party. My name is Agnese. I'm a member of the Socialist Workers' Party in Hackney, and I will be facilitating this Q&A tonight. We've all seen the huge disruption and chaos on the financial markets following Trump's tariffs, and we're hoping that with the Zoom call, we can provide some clarity on what's happening. So the way this is going to work tonight is that there is an opportunity for everyone on the call to put questions to Alex. Alex Callinicos is a Marxist author who has written extensively on capitalism, political economy, and Marxism. And we will hear some introductory comments from Alex for about 15 minutes, and then we will have an opportunity to ask a couple rounds of questions for Alex to answer. And there's two ways in which you can ask questions. Number one, you can raise your virtual hand and we will call on you to speak. Or you can also post a written question in the chat, which should be available for everyone to join. I hope that all makes sense. And I'm going to hand over to Alex to kick us off for about 15 minutes.
Hello, everyone. This has been a very bizarre 10 days. All the tariffs imposed, taken away, reimposed, huge upheavals in the markets, in the stock markets, in other financial markets. But it's important to bear in mind that this is something that has affected people's lives, from Chinese workers being laid off because of the tariffs to people panic buying in US stock markets because they're afraid that prices are going to really shoot up. So this is an opportunity to try and make sense of what's happening. Now, it's tempting to put it in personal terms. And it's certainly true that Trump's vanity, stupidity, and bullying are very prominent features of the present situation. But I think we should treat Trump as a symptom, a very obnoxious and unpleasant symptom, but a symptom of an underlying crisis. And that is the long-term crisis of US imperialism, the dominant capitalist state in the world since the Second World War, but one that is grappling with its economic decline compared to its major rivals, and above all, compared to China, much the biggest challenger to US imperialism's global hegemony. Now, the decline of US imperialism has been going on for a long time, really since the 1960s. And what we've seen over that period is a number of attempts, which are often described as shocks, by the American state forcibly to shift the balance of forces in its favor. And I want to talk about two earlier ones because I think they help to put the present Trump shock into some kind of context. Okay, so let's go back to the first of these shocks, the so-called Nixon shock in August 1971. President Richard Nixon takes the US dollar off gold. The international monetary system was underpinned by the US dollar as the main reserve currency, but it in turn had been tied to gold. In August 1971, Nixon takes the dollar off gold and allows it to float freely on the currency exchanges. He also imposes tariffs, what were then called an imports surcharge. This was a reaction in particular to the competition that then was coming to US firms from Japan. Now, that intervention created some advantages for US imperialism. In particular, it created it supercharged the dollar. Once the link was between the dollar and gold was broken, the dollar became something, a money that the US government and US firms could exchange for economic actors and states in the rest of the world without there being anything behind it. This is what's sometimes called the exorbitant privilege of the dollar that has made it the much the most powerful currency in the world and has made the US the center of the global financial system. But the Nixon shock led to a period of intensified competition among the leading capitalist powers that saw inflation take off on a spectacular scale. That led to the second shock. In October 1979, Paul Volcker, who was the head of the American Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, sharply increased interest rates. And this had the effect, as Volcker had hoped, of increasing the exchange rate of the dollar against the other major currencies. Now, the effect of this was to make investment much more expensive and to make American goods, US goods, more expensive than those produced in the other major capitalist countries. This had a terrible effect on manufacturing industry in the US, and it provided the basis for a brutal employers' offensive under Ronald Reagan that gravely weakened the organized labor in the United States. But raising interest rates in the US had a global effect. It imposed a rigid monetary discipline on the entire world that many ways was the point at which neoliberalism, the reign of the market, was globalized. It ceased to be something being pursued in a few countries like Chile, Britain, and the US, and became a global policy regime for capitalism. And one effect of that was a reorganization of capitalist production, in which a number of economies in the global south became suppliers of components or goods produced cheaply by low-paid labor to US multinational corporations. So it was a very important change, which in many ways has underlined the neoliberal era. Now we come to the present. Now we come to the Trump shock. Trump and his administration, the Trump shock of April 2025, think that the process in which manufacturing production has shifted away from the US and indeed other advanced capitalist countries, but they don't care about those so much, to parts of the global south, most importantly China and other East Asian countries, has gone much too far. And they want to, or at least they say they want, to bring manufacturing production back to the United States. And that's the background to the imposition of these, in some cases, huge tariffs, most severely against China, more than 100% in the case of China. There are two aims, I think, in the tariffs. First of all, it's to discipline the US's own allies in Europe, North America, and other parts of the world, Asia, and so on and so forth. In other words, they will get reductions in their tariffs if they offer the US different kinds of economic concessions. And also, this is particularly important in Europe, they engage in burden sharing. What that means is they spend more on their own defense, which will allow the US, the Pentagon, to concentrate on the main threat in China. The second aim is what's sometimes called decoupling. In other words, breaking the now very profound links between the US and Chinese economies. That's a very important aim on their part. And in particular, if you look, I mean, the way they decided these tariffs is ridiculous in intellectual terms. But if you look, some of the largest tariffs are on economies like Vietnam and Cambodia. Why have they been picked out as special treatment? Because they play a very important role in the supply chains that start from China and end up in the United States. They want to break the links between the US and China because they think that will both allow manufacturing to return to the United States and drastically reduce the power of the Chinese economy. Okay, how much longer have I got, Agnese?
You've got 7 minutes.
Oh, good, good. Okay. That should give me time to say what I want to say in the rest of this introduction. There are two big problems with this strategy. The first is that Trump just thinks the US can do what it likes. It's the most powerful state and the most powerful economy in the world, and it can just push all the other states in the world around. The problem with this is although capitalism is a very brutal system and it's based upon exploitation, its logic, and this is something that Marx brings out very well in his masterpiece Capital, its logic is impersonal. As one interpreter of Capital has put it, it's a system of impersonal domination. They're these impersonal structures of competition and investment that no one controls, not even the biggest firms or the biggest state. The logic, in particular, of capitalist competition and accumulation, impose them on all actors, even the most powerful. And one way in which we've seen this in the past few days is through the power of the financial markets. What we've seen is, sure, we've seen very sharp falls in stock markets, US shares, particularly in the US, being sold off very substantially. Something much more significant has taken place. We've seen a sharp fall in the most important bond market, which is the market in US treasuries, US government bonds. The US government is a vast borrower, and it borrows money by selling treasury bonds to investors, particularly actually in East Asia, Japan, China, and so on and so forth, who are lending money to the United States. Now, this in many ways is the linchpin of the global monetary system. When the link between the dollar and gold was broken in 1971, the linchpin then became US treasuries. These were the safest assets in the entire financial system. So in times of crisis, when capitalists panic, they rush to buy US treasuries as the safest assets. Their money will be all right in those. Now, this broke down last week. Shares fell, the dollar fell, and also the prices of bonds fell. And that led to Trump blinking. He presents himself as this super tough guy. You know, he models himself really on what are called the made men of the New York in which he grew up. He's internalized their style, but he blinked. When the bond market collapsed, they were faced with a very severe financial meltdown. The only time it's happened before was at the start of the pandemic in March 2020. So they stepped back, and in particular, Trump suspended the 90-day, suspended for 90 days the main tariffs. But he left out China. China was the exception. He sought to punish China for retaliating, so you had these two giants of the global economy imposing more than 100% tariffs on each other's exports to them. But here he ran into a second problem, which is those supply chains that he wants to crush. The US consumer market, also other sections of industry, and including the defense industry, but the consumer market is hugely dependent on production in China in economies closely integrated with the Chinese economy. And at some point, one of the coaches around Trump must have said to him, you know, if we let these tariffs on Chinese imports go ahead, iPhones are going to double in cost. Their price will double. They'll go up from $1,000 to $2,000. And so we see that in a very secretive way, they announced that smartphones and a number of other high-tech goods from China were excluded from the punitive tariff on China. Trump blinked again. And in both cases, the common factor is that Trump was confronted with the realities of global capitalism, both how global markets work and with the dependence of the United States on China. That's what it is. When it comes to a vast range of goods, it's the US that is dependent on China, not the other way around. So he's confronted with the embedded power of China within the global market. Nevertheless, the effect of all this is hugely destabilizing. And we know who is going to pay for it. If Trump gets his way and does succeed in breaking the link between China and the US, I don't think he can, but he could cause a lot of disruption. Then it'll be particularly workers in China, also in Cambodia and Vietnam and Mexico, countries in the global south with very poor populations who will suffer, who will be laid off, suffer wage cuts, but also workers in the United States, including many who voted for him. And unfortunately and mistakenly, they'll pay the price. Nouriel Roubini, the one relatively critical economist, pointed out in the US that Trump is protecting better off households by not implementing tariffs on smartphones and so on and so forth. But there are a whole mass of much more modest consumer goods that are going to go up vastly in price, and that will hit working people in the US. So what we're seeing is a struggle between rival imperialist states, above all the US and China, rival capitalists, the victims, ordinary working people. The important political question is when those working people are able to organize and hit back. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Alex. Now it's over to you to ask all the questions. If you've just joined us, we're taking questions for Alex to answer either by raising your virtual hand on Zoom or by putting them in the chat. I'm going to be timing your questions to up to 3 minutes. This is because I want to make sure I squeeze in as many questions as possible. And after I have a few questions come in, Alex will respond, and then we'll do another round or two depending on timing. So I will start by reading out a question on the Zoom chat. It's from Adel in Bradford, and it says, given the economic instability triggered by Trump's tariff wars and the ripple effects on global markets, how does the SWP see the role of socialist policy in protecting working class communities from future market shocks? And what practice steps should be taken to build resilience against the capitalist systems that enable such volatility? And then there is also another question on the chat from Mark Krantz, Manchester. For the US led by Trump, Israel is a distraction. Israel is a burden, a sideshow to the US real target, which is China. Why are US warships not in the South China Sea, but instead in the Red Sea, defending European trade routes through the Suez Canal? Trump pulled the plug on Zelensky. Will Trump dump Netanyahu to complete the pivot to Asia and focus on the next fight? And then I will now call on Ebony from West Kingston, followed by Gary Lewis. And Ebony, you will be unmuted in a minute, so you can speak.
Yes, my surname, but never mind. Um,
Oh, sorry.
yes, okay, never mind. Yeah, thanks, Alex. That was informative. I put in the chat that at the end of the day, many Americans thought that the tariffs wouldn't affect them. They would only affect the countries that impose the tariffs. And I'm wondering, the fact that he's placed these dubious tariffs like 120% or 124% on China and all these like pathetic, idiotic figures on various countries, particularly the two closest allies, Mexico and Canada. I'm just wondering, as consumers in this country, how do you see that affecting us? Because we're supposed to be, in this special relationship with America. So I'm just wondering, do you foresee um, a disaster on the living standards in this country and the fact that we're already in a crisis with regards to the cost of living? So I'm just wondering, how do you see the future between trading with this country and the United States? Thank you.
Thank you. Now I will call Gary Lewis, followed by a question on Zoom that I'll read out.
Okay, I think I wanted to come back on a question regarding the dollar de-dollarization issue that's been mooted around on left circles for a while now. You talk about the Nixon's breakup from the dollar in '71, in which that gave the dollar exorbitant power, primarily military power, up until recently. There is a call by a number of countries. I'm not sure if you had time to discuss this in your introduction. The rise of the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, China, South America, etc., and others. They're wishing to break away from this structure of the dollar. Primarily, what we've seen in Russia. Russia's foreign reserves were stolen in a sense. Through sanctions, and the only way to get around that is to go on themselves in a way. With these countries trying to break from the dollar. How much do you think is going to succeed? Although it's still very early days yet. The BRIC countries can manage the challenge of the dollar so far. I just wanted to ask that sort of raises the question really. Can they break away from this sort of de-dollarization and create a new form of currency worldwide?
Thank you. Next, I will read out Paulina's questions from the chat. If the tariffs shake the market hegemony of USA and help decrease its soft imperial power, what does it mean to the global south in the long run? And now I will briefly take Luis Velasquez, and then Alex can come back to the first few questions. Or Una and Luis.
Hi, sorry. I was just wondering about with, current austerity, and all the cuts to social security and welfare, what the impact of kind of higher prices for everyone will be, and especially kind of in the UK with Reeves and her fiscal rules, what that could look like for people here in the short term and kind of the increased cuts and austerity that we're seeing.
Thank you, Una. Okay, I will give a few minutes to Alex to come back to the first lot of questions.
Firstly, in response to Mark's question about why the US continues to back up Israel, the answer is because Israel is now a formidable military power that is utterly dependent on the US. That's what we've seen with Netanyahu. Biden let him do what he liked when Trump came along, and Trump told him to make, unfortunately, what proved to be a ceasefire he did what Trump told him. In the increasingly competitive world that we find ourselves in, that's an asset, although there's clearly a big downside with Israel because Israel is so unpopular now. And one thing that's happening in the Gulf region in particular is China's influence is increasing. It's the biggest buyer of Middle Eastern oil now. So having a very reliable ally in the area is quite important from the point of view of the US. Now, some of the other questions. Gary asks, it's a bit related about de-dollarization. In other words, lots of people are pissed off, including large sections of the capitalist world, especially in the global south, are pissed off with US financial dominance. And in particular, as Gary mentioned, the way in which the US and the EU can use their dominance of the financial system to seize Russia's reserves and try to impose comprehensive sanctions on China scared lots of people. So so the idea of an alternative reserve currency to the dollar is quite attractive. The states in the BRICS aren't a coherent bloc in any sense. They're not in a position, I think, to provide an alternative currency. Nevertheless, Trump has inflicted huge blows to the credibility of the US in the past couple of months, and that will make an alternative reserve currency more attractive. The most plausible alternative reserve currency is the euro, which is already well established and traded internationally and so on. The problem is that the EU are a shambles in terms of their decision-making processes, and therefore haven't, I think, have got a bit of a way to go before they are in a position to provide a reliable reserve currency. But the crisis may encourage them to try and move further in a way that would allow the euro to be an alternative reserve currency. So I think that's something that could begin to develop now. Patricia's question about the impact of the tariffs in Britain. Well, let's just note that, Keir Starmer has made a speciality of crawling to Trump. In exchange, he's got zip. He's got, some economies now, with all these shifts in the tariffs, have the tariffs suspended. Britain, British cars and steel and so on now have 25% tariffs. The rest of their exports are subject to the standard 10% tariff that Trump announced 10 days ago. So Britain has got very little for it. That will, for crawling to Trump, that will have disruptive consequences. And to the extent that this leads to an acceleration of inflation, then we'll suffer here like lots of people in the rest of the world. And I should emphasize, in response to the question, I've lost the name of the person who asked it, that any suffering in relatively prosperous countries like Britain is hugely magnified when it comes to people in the global south on much lower living standards and economically much more vulnerable. That is related to both the question about austerity and about alternatives. One of the things about crises like this is that the possible suddenly becomes possible. Remember the way that Starmer would say, Starmer started off when he was elected leader and pretending to be on the left with all sorts of commitments to extending public ownership to nationalization. And one by one, he dumped all of those in favor of conciliating the financial markets. But hey, presto, now he's probably going to nationalize British Steel. And if you listen to ministers, they say the world has changed. We're facing a crisis. We need the steel for the railways and hospitals, and so not just for submarines and tanks, and so forth. It's amazing what a crisis makes possible. And so we have to say, okay, what we want is a comprehensive alternative to capitalism based upon socialist planning, on working people collectively deciding how resources are going to be used, not just on a national, but an international scale. But a step towards it is to say, okay, you're nationalising British Steel, how about nationalising Thames Water? And indeed, all the other utilities. I mean, my electricity bill has more than doubled in the last week or so. And this is affecting lots and lots of people. In other words, the defense of living standards in a crisis and the defense of jobs and living standards in a crisis like this can represent the start of a socialist fight back. The other thing about inflation is terrible and it causes immense suffering, but it's a big incentive to workers to organize and strike to defend their wages. We saw that in the burst of inflation in 22-23. I think if inflation does take off again, we will see more wage struggles like those we saw then, and that can provide the beginnings of a real fight back. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Alex. Second round of questions. I will call for Fu Wong, followed by Alex Bradley.
Thanks. I would just make one observation, which is that what is useful about what Alex said is that there is a system to this. There's a history to this. Because all the time we read that it's about the capriciousnesses of one person, a powerful person. So it leads me to my question, therefore, is that given the fact that the global economy, am I correct by saying that since for the past 10 years or even after COVID, the global economy has not been increasing? The American share has been, they've apparently been quite successful relative to lots of other countries. But my question is, because I've heard this discussed in Marxism, is this a case of Trump adopting Chinese state capitalist methods? Yeah, that last time round, it was relying on finance, the markets, and so on. Now, I think also that Trump wants to make sure that the last time round, it appears to me that, in the crisis of 2008, Chinese capitalism came out better than American and Western capitalism. Is Trump trying to say, I want a bigger share in not a large global market of capitalism, and he's adopting Chinese capitalist methods? I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Alex Bradley, followed by a question I will read out of the chat.
I've had my first day. I'm sorry, I work for the Royal Mail. I've had my first full day back at work. I think one thing I just want to point out an anecdote, I suppose, is somebody walked into the post office, wanted to do something special delivery, and then the guy just turned around and said, "Oh, they went up this week," and it was double the price. The thing is, there's things about the small things that people starting to notice that happen. I've been out of work for about 6 months. Sorry, I've been away from work for about 6 months. This is my first full day. It's interesting that people are they aren't talking about it very much in the way that impacts them personally. But you can see that what's happened over the last month or two, that it's starting to kind of weigh down on people a bit. And I think the last speaker actually sort of nailed a little bit of it. It's the fact that kind of, Trump's move from multilateral to bilateral, I want to make a deal, is something that I've been talking about for a couple of months with all the people that I know. And I think it'd be good if Alex, the other Alex, would talk about that, because it's it's something that's very thorny. I mean, as a branch officer of the CWU, it's a thorny thing about how we sort of bring it down and nail it to something that, because we know that daily it's going to start happening. And I found it, and me and my partner have found it incredibly confusing and unfocused as regards what the hell Trump's doing. But you know what the baseline is, and you know that you need to build a movement. The one thing is that I think what Alex said was, the fact is that as soon as it lands, then we will start to see something against it. And my only question is about the fact that we've had those democratic rallies and stuff like that in America, and where we see it going from there, Sanders, et al., and all the rest of it. I will leave it there.
Thank you. Okay, I will read out a question from the chat, and after that, I will call Rob Halpin. So the question is from Laura Ma. Thanks for Alex's introduction. I agree that there are a lot of interactions and connections between US and China's economy. It is not good for two countries' economy and development if too many this kind of trade wars. Maybe third parties mediation is needed. I would like to ask what the role of international organizations such as the UN and WTO could play in this event. Okay. After Rob Halpin, I will read out another question.
A Chinese commentator on Channel 4 News on the reception of the news of Trump with the tariffs, and especially the aggression unleashed against China, was quoted as saying, "China has been around for 5,000 years, and after this statement from President Trump, we expect to be around for 5,000 years more." Isn't it ironic that the most mature, solid, and stable society is a communist state on which capitalism rests? And I just wondered whether Alex has got an opinion on that particular one. But the thing is that we have to bring things closer to home, and that is that with the trade tariffs, Britain, in its unique position as being outside of the EU and outside of any meaningful trading bloc, thanks to Brexit, a policy that's now coming up to 10 years, which has been an unmitigated disaster, with the loss of 100 billion pounds a year to the British economy, a 5% depletion of our GDP, and a continuing running sore in our trading relationships with both the EU and the rest of the world, we are still ignoring the obvious elephant in the room, and all we get on the left is radio silence. And it's got to stop. You've got to wake up. We have to stop. We have to start talking about this elephant in the room. Because the thing is the whole point of being a socialist is we're in the business of, enhancing, elevating, and improving the conditions of the working class. And until we start getting real, that formula is in vain. So I'd like Alex to actually bite the nettle, or grab the nettle, and reflect on the disaster that Brexit has been for this country. And now we have got, for want of a better term, our asses hanging in the wind, thanks to these multiple tariffs that are obviously going to come our way. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Just after I read the question, I'm going to call on Arthur Nico. So the question is from Charlotte Hamid. The Birmingham bin strike is a symptom of the crisis made concrete and is becoming a crucial test for the workers' movement in Britain. No surprise the Labour government is sending in the army. The unions must respond. Okay, after Arthur Nico, I will call Duncan from Edinburgh.
Can you hear me? Just a quick question. I don't know if it's been covered, but just a thought. But how strong a hegemony does Alex feel that Trump carries within the ruling class within the United States? are there? I mean, there are clearly sections who have clear interests that are diametrically opposed to the way that he wants to take the US economy and its trading relationships with the world. Are they likely to feel powerful enough, and are they likely at all to act with other similar interests abroad, for instance, to try and undermine that strategy, and can that lead to greater conflict if you get my drift globally as well? I just agree with what Alex was saying. Alex Bradley was saying, is I think there is clearly we're in. It's reminding me very similar of the crisis back in 2008, 2009 as well. The fact that I do think we are beginning to see situation where the machinations of capital are being exposed to some extent, and I do think there's a possibility in there for certainly socialists to argue about what capitalism actually means in terms of the threat it poses to the world and to the working class, the working class's interests. So there is opportunity in that, but it could also bring quite serious dangers as well in the current climate. So just what Alex thinks about all that. Thanks.
Thank you. After Duncan from Edinburgh, I will call Martin Empson.
Hi, very interesting talk. My question is, Alex talked about not focusing too much on the personality of Trump and so forth. What I was wondering was this kind of retreat on some of the tariffs. When Trump disappears, will we see a reversion to the relationships of the United States and to NATO and its other trading allies? There's kind of one that the Democrats had. In other words, is this just a kind of flash in the pan related to the politics of a faction of the Republican Party, or is it something more structural? Because although he's reduced the baseline tariffs to 10%, etc., over the 90-day period, we've still got 25% tariffs on steel, aluminium, and motor cars. Is that going to stay? Trump or no Trump? Does the United States now have, because of its position, failing economically, does it have to get tough, even with its allies now? Or is that just a reflection of a political faction? In other words, is Trump really in tune with what the American ruling class wants now or not? Thank you.
Thank you. After Martin Empson, I will call on Alex to come back on these questions.
I wanted to make a point about the way that Trump's tariffs can actually undermine his own position. If you look at some of the biggest states in the US that voted for Trump, places like Montana, North and South Dakota, which voted hugely for Trump, 93% in Montana, 69, I think, percent in North Dakota. These are states that get vast amounts and rely on vast amounts of imports from countries like Canada and Mexico. And as Alex said, it's not just about smartphones. This is about agricultural fertilizer, raw materials for building houses. And actually, it's going to be difficult for those Trump supporters who are going to be massively impacted by these tariffs to find a way forward that doesn't end up with them blaming the president. Now, this isn't the problem. Is for socialists is that this doesn't necessarily automatically head in a progressive direction. It's great that in those states and in many others there were huge protests recently against Trump. But actually, you can also see a right wing using the opportunity of such crises to strengthen their position, to blame migrants, immigrants, and minorities, and so on. And I think the task for socialists in this situation is not to sow illusions in projects like the European Union, who are racist and protectionist and in their own way. The task for socialists is to say this exposes capitalism. When Marx and Lenin and people like that wrote about this being capitalism being and the capitalists being a band of warring brothers, this is what it looks like. Capitalists who are prepared to destroy millions of people's lives in the interests of their profits. And it means that we're here in the UK. We have to build radical revolutionary socialist alternatives because Labour isn't going to do it. I mean, Labour is bending over backwards to befriend Trump. Look at what they're doing to workers in struggle. Look at what's happening in Birmingham. The way they've attacked those bin workers. They've used the police. They've used the courts, and now they're talking of using the armors. The left has to get behind every act of resistance in this context. Use what Trump is doing to expose capitalism and try and build a socialist alternative. And if we don't do it, who's standing in the sidelines? People like Farage and Reform, who are trying to pose as the friends of the working man in this context. There's a huge historic opportunity for the left, and if we don't do it, the risks are terrible.
Thank you, Martin. Over to you, Alex, to answer some of these.
First of all, in response to Fu Wang's question about is Trump trying to copy Chinese style state capitalism, it's not sufficiently coherent to say that he's doing that in any consistent sort of way, but it's certainly something that Biden tried to do. Biden had a whole program of state-directed reindustrialization of the US that was very much a response to what China was doing. And this reflects the fact, and this relates to another of the questions, that China is seen as a problem and a threat to the broad ranks of the American ruling class, not just those closer to Trump. So last time, Trump imposed tariffs on China in his first term, which Biden continued. Okay, this then relates to the question that Arthur asked about what is Trump's standing within the American ruling class. Well, I tell you for nothing, it's not as good as it was 2 weeks ago. I mean, you just have to look at the markets to see that. I mean, Trump, I would say it's become clear that there are two kinds of bases to the Trump 2. One are the hard nationalists blurring into fascists. Steve Bannon, if you look at Steve Bannon, he's essentially trying to build a mass fascist movement within the framework of the Republican Party. And he is an alliance, sorry, my head is getting confused. I'll remember his name in a minute. He's in alliance with the Trump advisor who is most strongly pushing the tariffs as a way of hitting China and decoupling from China. Then there are people like Musk and other big tech super billionaires who share some of this agenda and are nationalistic and very anti-democratic, more so than in his own way Bannon is, but a part of global capitalism. So it's been very clear, Musk, wants skilled migrant workers to come into the US so he can exploit them. He's very hooked up with China. His biggest Tesla plant is in China, and he doesn't like the tariffs. So there are divisions in the Trump camp, and I think the core of the American ruling class are very unhappy about what happened. One thing that apparently changed Trump's mind about the tariffs that led him to retreat was when the head of J.P. Morgan Chase said that a big recession was coming. So Trump, there were lots of bosses who weren't enthusiasts for Trump, but liked the idea of his tax cut. Now they're not so sure, and there's a confusion in the ranks. The problem in the US is the alternative. Yes, there are huge rallies being organized by the left of the Democratic Party, Bernie Sanders and AOC. The problem with them was that they never mounted a real challenge to Biden, and the American left won't progress if it doesn't break out of the trammels of the Democratic Party. Okay, let's see what other questions to address. Laura asked about international institutions. What role will they play in solving this? Nothing. Nothing. The United Nations has been reduced to a farce in the course of the genocide in Palestine. We shouldn't forget this is still going on. The slaughter is still continuing. The World Trade Organization was reduced under Biden to a totally between rival capitalist states. One of the main things that Lenin argued back at the time of the First World War is don't trust what we now call international organizations, and he was completely right. Rob and Brexit. Yes, Brexit as it was implemented was the result of a deal between the European Commission and Boris Johnson, both of whom wanted the hardest possible Brexit. In the case of the European Commission, to make an example of Britain, in the case of Johnson, because he wanted to win the support of the Tory right wing, and it has caused a certain amount of damage. But let's not get carried away. People are pointing out the imperialist and racist character of the EU, but if you look at Britain's economic and social performance, it's not very different from that of France and Germany. European capitalism in general is in a lot of trouble, and we need to address the causes of that trouble rather than simply banging on about Brexit. It just doesn't address the scale of the problem now. We come to discuss Trump versus China, and we end up talking about Brexit. Come on, be serious. And I just want to, final point, I think Charlotte is absolutely right, Charlotte from Glasgow, to emphasize the significance of the Birmingham bin workers strike. Because here we have, particularly with the involvement of the Ministry of Defence, not just the Labour Council in Birmingham, but the Labour government against a group of workers. It's very important that the bin workers in Birmingham win, and we have to see this as part of a broader struggle by the working class in Britain to defend their living standards and to force concessions from the Labour government. The Labour government is happy to make concessions to the financial markets and the bosses. We should force it to make concessions to us.
All right, thank you, Alex. I think we have time for one last small round, and I'm going to call Hayden James, followed by Una and Lewis, followed by Rob Hoffman. But before Hayden speaks, I just wanted to shout out all the solidarity messages that we have in the chat, especially those from Germany, US, Canada, and more. That's really cool to see. Hayden, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for the introduction, Alex. Good evening. Yeah, my name's Hayden. I'm based in Islington, although you might hear my bumpkin slang from the antipodes. So my question is, what I'd like to get your perspective on is what this all signifies for the contemporary left. Over the past few years, I've observed a growing tendency among younger leftists to adopt a form of 20th century style campism, this time with the People's Republic of China, assuming the ideological role once held by the Soviet Union. This seems to be accompanied by the emergence of what might be described as a neo-Stalinist or neo-Maoist orientation. It appears to me that these tendencies are likely to intensify in the present conjuncture. As someone increasingly situated in the position of an educator rather than activist, I'm interested in your thoughts on how the left should navigate this moment, both in terms of critically engaging with these ideological developments and in helping to educate younger generations about the recent history of the left, its strategic failures, and the terrain of struggling likely to define the latter half of the 2020s. Does this moment open the door for revolutionary sentiments in the working class? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll call Una and Lewis and then Rob.
After the Second World War, we had like the golden age of like social democracy. That was like when everyone could buy houses, wages were big, everything was good. But in social democracy, we still have like the state is still influenced by the ruling class. And like this new thing that China is bringing after this whole thing, and especially with this thing now, is like the ruling class is the state, and then like if this becomes a thing of like after this whole tariff spread over the world, like every country start like we need to go to this method of organizing, and then state capitalism becomes one thing, like globally, what does this thing mean to like to class struggle and like to a socialist battle? Like what state capitalism is a form of more like more strong of capitalism in certain way.
Thank you. I will call Rob, and then we have one last hand from Kim, so I will call them as well.
As Alex said, Trump suspended some tariffs, but not all tariffs, because the stock market was tanking and because of the bond route. It wasn't something he did deliberately in order to give himself or his friends a buying opportunity. A slumping stock exchange and a bond route, which means rising interest rates, are a disaster potentially for the American economy and indeed for the world economy. Subsequently, he suspended tariffs on $385 billion worth of Apple phones because of the effect of 145% tariffs on them. But nonetheless, there are tariffs coming down the road on Apple phones because he wants tariffs on semiconductors to try and decouple, reduce the dependency on China. That's a security question for him and a point of continuity, of course, with Biden. But there's a dilemma between him, as it were, pursuing that security issue and affecting the consumption of American workers on whose votes he had depended. Tariffs raise prices and depress demand, and therefore they are intrinsically, on a broad scale, both recessionary and inflationary. In other words, they portend stagflation. But in the face of that, I think there's a big problem in the United States, which I'd like Alex to comment on, because there's two things you can do in the face of a recession. You can spend more money as a federal government, and you can cut taxes, but they have a huge fiscal deficit, 6% of GDP, 120% national debt of GDP, and the central bank could cut interest rates, but not in the face of inflation. And Jerome Powell, of course, is not a political appointee of Trump. So it seems to me that lying ahead, there are big problems for us because of what Trump has done, but there are big problems for him. And I hope that will stimulate the fight back we all want to see.
Thank you, Rob. Kim will be our last speaker before Alex comes back in for closing remarks.
I feel like it's a bit simple, but I guess it's one that I feel like needs to be asked. I was going to say that how can we, as revolutionary socialists, when we're out on the streets talking to people, explain that these tariffs that Trump is imposing on the world are interlinked to other crises happening at the moment, such as what's going on in Palestine, the attack on trans rights, the austerity cuts, because no doubt there'll be some people that will be there like, okay, but how's this going to affect me? Okay, but I don't see how this has got to do with the UK. And I guess, again, the point with Farage is a really important point, because there are going to be some people that think Labour are no good, Tory are no good. I'm going to go to Reform because that is the political climate, unfortunately, we're in. Like, in Birmingham, we had a rally against Nigel Farage when he came, and we had about a few hundred people there, and it was brilliant to show that, one, excuse my language, we won't tolerate his racist crap, and two, that my hometown of Birmingham is a beautiful multicultural city, and we will not have the likes of him try and tear us apart, because at the end of the day, we're the majority, they're the minority. So, yeah, again, how can we as revolutionary socialists interlink all these struggles with what's going on in America? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, back to Alex.
Let me just thank everyone for all the great questions and thoughts, also in the chat, not just speaking as Kim just did. I'll try and respond quite quickly. First of all, in response to Luis, I don't think we're going to face an age of global state capitalism. In a way, what's happened to Trump shows that. The power of states, even the biggest states, and this is as true of China as it is of the US, isn't great enough to manage the flows of goods and capital that stretch across the world. That's their problem. Remember what happened to Liz Truss. Everyone laughs at Liz Truss. What happened to her was that she spooked the equivalent of the US bond market, the gilt market, the market in British government bonds. Global capitalism, in other words, passed a vote of no confidence in her, and she was crushed. Now, it's much harder to get rid of an American president than a British prime minister, but the markets have passed a vote of at the very least censure in Trump. I don't think capitalism more and more, not just in finance, but also in production, is organized on a global scale. So I think the state, they more and more lean on the state to manage their problems, but the state isn't in a position to overcome them. So that's one point. Rob is right that Trump is faced with very big problems. The question of the deficit, in other words, the fact that the US government borrows much more than it receives in tax revenue and so on, is a big one for American capitalism. Trump himself makes a lot of it. Why has Elon Musk been scurrying around with his gang of, fascist or semi-fascist helpers to try and slash US government spending to reduce the deficit? One of the problems that Trump has was that the tariffs were supposed to generate the revenues that would keep the deficit under control, in particular, that would allow Trump to continue the huge tax cut for the rich that he introduced in his first term and that is due to expire at the end of the year. If there's all this messing around about the tariffs, they may get in much less than they did, than they were expecting. And yes, the Fed, the US central bank, may say, sorry, we can't cut interest rates. Maybe we have to increase them in order to keep inflation under control. This could produce another institutional crisis in the American state. The only branch of the US government that the Republicans don't control is the Federal Reserve. They control the executive, they control both houses of Congress, they've packed the Supreme Court with these right-wing judges. They don't control the Fed. I think that if Trump is confronted with a recession and the Fed doesn't play, he'll go for Jerome Powell. He'll try and subordinate the Fed to his authority. So that's a potential major crisis of the US state, because these days, one product of neoliberalism is that it's the central banks that are the main economic managers. Okay, I've gone on a bit too much about that. I think Hayden raised an important point about campism. Lots of the left quite rightly hate US imperialism, but that then leads them to have illusions in its rivals. China, particularly at the minute, because the Chinese seem so more kind of rational than Trump does, but also Russia under Putin, and that's a big mistake. These are imperialist powers too. What we're seeing is a growing global conflict between rival imperialisms, and we have to take the same position that Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg did during the First World War. We don't support any of the rivals. This is an inter-imperialist conflict. The only solution is to get rid of the imperialist system that drives them. The only solution is socialist revolution. Now, of course, it's easy enough to say that, but how do we build more effective socialist politics? And I think that comes back to Kim's final question, which is, of course, very relevant, because the people who can make a lot out of this crisis are the extreme right. You know, why is Starmer talking about the nationalisation of British Steel? I think it's at least partially related to the fact that Farage and Reform called for the nationalisation of British Steel. Trump is posing, holding trade union leaflets, calling for the nationalisation of British Steel. It's completely opportunist because he's an economic Thatcherite, an extreme Thatcherite, but he wants to eat into Labour's working class base. That underlines the importance, first of all, of taking on the far right, but of building an alternative, a socialist alternative that shows that there are other solutions than those of the far right, better, more progressive solutions based upon the best in our society, which is the daily solidarity of working people in their everyday lives, not just in struggles. And I think it's possible to say to people, look, you know, there's a struggle between these rival capitalists, but whatever the differences between them, they're going to make us pay. We're going to find ourselves confronted with more rising prices, with attempts to hold down our wages, with cuts in our services, and therefore we have to fight back. And we need to link that fight back to the vision of a very different kind of socialist society that will place the resources of the world under democratic control and allow us finally properly to address the threat of climate catastrophe. But I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Alex. And thank you everyone for joining the call. We hope you found it useful. We recorded this event so we can upload it onto our YouTube channel and you can watch it back and share it. And remember to check out the Socialist Workers website for more analysis, for information on our local meetings, and for discussing more, and also to find out how to join the Socialist Workers' Party and be involved in the resistance. Thank you again for joining and have a nice rest of your evening.